Welcome again. Thank you for joining us. I think I know actually almost everybody in the room, but for those online, my name is Wendy Hurlbert and I'm the President and CEO of Life Sciences BC. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're joining this event on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, upon whose lands we are honored to live, work, and play. Life Sciences BC is a not-for-profit, non-government organization funded through membership and the generous contributions of our sponsors and partners. Our members include academic and research institutions, local and global companies working in health tech, med tech, devices diagnostics, biotech, and therapeutics, and in addition, numerous companies that have identified life sciences as a strategic vertical and who provide invaluable support and services to our ecosystem. At each event, we like to welcome our latest new members. And so today we'd like to welcome to the LSBC family, so to speak, Argonex, Bowens FX Therapeutics, Polymorphic Biosciences, UBC Solder Creative Destruction Lab has returned as a member, Bristol Myers Squibb, and Cascade TX Digital Therapeutics. We're always accepting new members, so please feel to reach out if you're interested in membership. Today's event is made possible by the support of our long-standing sponsor, Blake's. Blake's Speaking Series is one of our longest-standing events, and we thank Joe and Kyle and Emma for their leadership in continuing to put this great event on. I think it was last year or the year before we moved into the beautiful facilities that we are in right now, and I can say that the view is much nicer here than where we used to host these events. So thank you very much for hosting us. I don't know if Laura is in the room, but Laura from Blake's is actually who really makes all of this happen, I think, behind the scenes. We're delighted to be holding this event both in person and online, as I mentioned. And one of the reasons that we really appreciate having the ability to do a hybrid event is by bringing speakers into our ecosystem from outside of the Vancouver community. So we're really privileged today to have some amazing speakers from outside of BC. To lead today's event and introduce our speakers, I would like to welcome partner at Blake's, Joe Garcia. I don't think you're a stranger to anybody in this room. Joe is a partner in the securities group at Blake's and helps run the National Life Sciences Group. His practice focuses on corporate finance and mergers and acquisitions. He advises public and private companies, investment dealers, venture capital, and private equity funds, and acts as an independent counsel to boards of directors. Before his career in law, Joe worked in corporate finance with a national investment bank and in clinical research with a multinational pharmaceutical company. He's a longtime passionate supporter of the sector and in particular LSBC. So thank you for your continued support, Joe, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Wendy, for a kind introduction. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. And thank you for joining us today. Just a quick note of thanks to Wendy and the entire Life Sciences BC team. They worked tirelessly on our behalf, and we're very appreciative of that and for the support to make these breakfasts and other events for our community happen. I'd also like to thank Kyle Meiswich and Emma Castante for their dedication to our life sciences sector and for their help with today's event. So we've all heard the phrase, may you live in interesting times. Well, indeed, we are living in interesting times. We are seeing challenges in the private and public finance markets. There's regulatory uncertainty, increased geographic competition, rapidly changing technology landscape, geopolitical uncertainty and disruptive economic forces playing havoc. All of this shows the importance of planning and execution and being resilient. I'm very pleased to moderate this panel discussion today. We've been hosting this event, I think, for more than 27 years, and the hybrid feature allows us to have incredibly distinguished participants on the panel, both locally and internationally, be able to join us. The distinguished panel today has a range of experience from finance, legal, um, uh, execution at the corporate level, banking, multinational pharma, regulatory. It's quite incredible the diverse and broad perspectives they'll bring today about the life sciences ecosystem and how to navigate these challenging times. So it's my pleasure now to introduce the panel members. Kevin Chaplin, who will be with me here today in Vancouver, is the CEO of Cardium. And this is an incredible company that has demonstrated grit in developing its technology over 18 years, and with recent success that Kevin can talk about with various FDA clearances. So Kevin is responsible for overseeing Cardium's operations, leading its executive team, setting its strategic direction, and engaging with key external stakeholders. Kevin joined Cardium shortly after its founding and has played a pivotal role in securing capital from a partner or from a premier investor syndicate and leading the company through its successful FDA pivotal study. Under his leadership, Cardium has grown to over 500 employees. Before leading the company, Kevin held senior roles in product management, marketing, and technical operations at Kodak, Sierra Wireless, and Accenture. Next, we have Daniel Lepanto, who is Senior Managing Director, Healthcare Mergers and Acquisitions at Leerink Partners. Dan is a Senior Managing Director and a member of the firm's M&A group. Prior to joining the firm in 2008, Dan spent 10 years at Cowen & Company, where he executed a range of biopharma and M&A transactions. Dan began his career in the mergers and acquisitions group at Wasserstein Perella. Dan has advised numerous significant biopharma and healthcare transactions over the span of his career, including the sales of Dicerna to Novo Nordisk, Demura to Eli Lilly, MPS to Shire, Cynosure to Hologic, TKT to Shire, Geltex to Genzyme, and the list goes on. Dan is strategic and excels at execution, including negotiations, understanding public company reporting, market communications, and regulatory issues relevant to acquisitions, corporate development, and capital market strategies. Next, we have Carlo Ramirez, who's a partner with Cooley LLP. Carlos practices corporate and securities law with an emphasis on private and public company representation and capital market transactions. He represents companies through their lifestyle, including in private and public financings, M&A, corporate governance, and SEC reporting and compliance matters. He also advises venture capital funds and investment banking firms in connection with such financings. Christopher Tan is the Executive Director, S&E, Business Development and Licensing, Infectious Diseases, Vaccines, and Oncology at Merck. Chris is an Executive Director in BD and Licensing and is located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. His primary responsibility is to serve as Merck spokesperson and scientific prospector for identifying, evaluating, and championing new research collaborations, preclinical assets, clinical assets, and technologies in the New England states and Eastern Canadian regions through licensing, acquisition, collaborations, co-development agreements, and strategic alliances. And finally, rounding out the panel, and not least, is Steve Usdin, who's a Senior Director with BioCentury. Steve has been BioCentury's Washington editor since 1993, covering political and policy issues affecting the life sciences sector. He is BioCentury's senior editor responsible for coverage of social issues involving biotechnology and a key driver of BioCentury's annual Back to School project. Steve is also co-host of the BioCentury show, the BioCentury's twice-monthly in-depth conversation with global leaders who are determining the future of medicine, and a regular contributor to the BioCentury This Week podcast. So with that, I'll join Kevin over at the table, and we'll have opening remarks from each of the speakers, and then we'll get into our discussion today. Thank you. So we thought we would start off the discussion with some introductory remarks from the panelists of what they're seeing in the life sciences ecosystem currently, not just some of the challenges, but potentially lead into ideas on things that companies can think about right now to set themselves apart or distinguish themselves in terms of planning and execution going forward. So with that, over to you, Kevin. Cardium has been incredibly successful and recently secured significant financing and FDA approval for its lead products. Maybe you can open.
Sure. Thanks very much, Joe, for hosting this event. And by way of background, I'm an engineer. I've been working at Cardium for about 18 years. That's how long we've been working on our technology. So it's been a long road for us, but as you said, this year has been phenomenally successful for us. We presented our pivotal data earlier this year, which was the best data ever for the condition we're treating, which is called atrial fibrillation. Following that, we got FDA approval, and just last week we did our first ever commercial cases in the US. So with FDA approval, this is kind of a timely topic because the US is a major market for us. It's the focus for the company. We'll be exporting from Canada to the US. We make all of our product here in Vancouver, and we'll export it down for doctors to use in the US. We don't have Health Canada approval yet. That's coming. But right now, our product is this exciting new technology, which is now for the first time available in the US. We did also secure a large financing round earlier this year. We raised $250 million US, 340 million Canadian, for those of you in the room. And that it allows us to build out our manufacturing capacity for this commercial launch. So we're looking to invest in manufacturing here in the US, here in Canada, for export to the US, but we're also shortly going to announce a new facility that we're building down in Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a medical technology hub where a lot of global companies go. So we have, we're at an exciting stage of the company, but we have a very interesting import-export dynamics as well with our manufacturing being in Canada, Costa Rica, and our main market.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. And Cardium is an example of being able to, over an extended period of time through focus and grit, publish great things despite challenges in markets and other regulatory and other considerations over time. Hey, Dan, over to you. What are you seeing in the capital markets and M&A environment at the moment?
So I think we're in a unique time in biopharma where the difference in sort of the quality of the environment for public companies and private companies, there's a massive gap, a very large gap that has formed. Public companies, if you were to look at how stocks are trading, look at the major indices, biopharma indices, all seem to be or are performing very well. The last 20 events that have occurred, we measure sort of clinical and strategic events that occur within the biopharma industry. The last 20 that you've seen in the public markets in the US have been to the positive side by over $10 billion of value creation. If you look at the financing market for public companies, the most recent 20 follow-ons have performed on average, have returned over 20% in one day and then through to current return for investors who participated in those follow-ons. So that's sort of one bucket. And I would say you have this very healthy capital market. driven by fundamentals, right? Where there's been positive clinical data. You had Unicure, for example, that had a readout of their pivotal data in Huntington's disease. And they showed the world that biotech is a pretty interesting place to invest when things go right. Stock traded up 250%, created $2 billion of value for investors in one day with that clinical event. I contrast that quickly with the private markets where we were looking at over the 5 quarters leading up to the first quarter of this year. You had sort of 5 or 6 on average IPOs per quarter, which is the kind of standard run rate you'd expect to see in a decent market. Not a great market, but in a decent market. In Q2 of this year, the market completely shut down for IPOs. There were 0 IPOs in Q2. This is right on the heels of when the new administration in the US implemented the tariffs, which was the first or second day of April. From that period until now, there's been only 1 IPO in biopharma. You've seen a carry-on effect into the private markets where private financing has dropped. And you've seen then an uptick, which is the positive side. I'm probably covering too much territory, but I'll just finish this out. On the positive side, you've seen this uptick in private company M&A as venture capital firms are realizing there really isn't a attractive path to going public, and they're pursuing M&A in lieu of that. So this meaningful divergence between public company, the quality of life for public companies, and the quality of life for private companies.
Thanks a lot, Dan. So in summary, capital is still available and companies are financing on news. So there continues to be investor interest, but the current uncertainty, I guess, has led to a dearth of IPOs. Although, is there any thoughts on the next year that this may change? Any catalyst that might lead to that?
So I think in general, one of the most wonderful parts of biopharma investors, especially the specialists, is I think that they do internalize and adapt to information quickly. Right? People forget, because biotech seems like this very entrepreneurial industry, and you think of it as it's very libertarian. It's the most heavily regulated industry in the United States. And so the people who invest in it understand that changes in administrations, changes in the personnel who are staffing FDA, NIH, those have meaningful read-throughs to various areas they're going to invest. And so they've learned to adapt quickly to it. So long-winded way of saying, we expect this is the more people have a chance to sort of digest what's going on, money will flow to the areas that are less affected by some of the changes that we're seeing. And we expect the capital markets to, at least on the private side, to begin to unclog. And we think you'll start to see IPOs again.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dan. Hey, Carlos, thanks for joining us today. Cooley, in your practice, has a very broad and deep life sciences client base, from private companies through to public, and including in investor work and bank work. What are you seeing at the moment on the private company side as we move forward, and understanding that we are in a challenging IPO market at this time?
Thank you. Yeah, and happy to be here. And completely echo Daniel's comments, I think, and just to kind of expand on the private markets, right? It's no surprise that kind of year to date or kind of trailing 12 months, the number of deals and the size of deals are down. I think if you're looking at later stage, call it Series B and beyond, I think we saw an uptick, which I wasn't expecting given the heavy amount, but an uptick of kind of structured deals with kind of warrant coverage, recaps, kind of pay to plays for companies that are kind of have maybe set a valuation in earlier times that was a little higher than what the market would pay for today. So we're seeing more of those deals. That being said, we are seeing companies funded, right? And I think it's a bit of a kind of a tale of two cities with, companies that are running out of cash with no kind of catalysts or milestones, on the horizon, are having, of course, a very hard time, fundraising, and usually, those deals get structured as I mentioned, with a bunch of bells and whistles, but there are deals that are getting done, with kind of, post proof of concept with catalysts, in the horizon, or with investors having looked at the data, that are good, right? I think one kind of phenomenon we're seeing these days as companies wait to go public, longer, is, I'm seeing a lot of lead or existing kind of investors, being hesitant to go out to new investors, or new third-party investors to kind of lead or set the price of a round, and instead, or given that a lot of these funds have kind of the dry powder, right? Instead of they're kind of just funding, the next round themselves, and to kind of prevent dilution until that IPO or until that kind of next milestone. So, a lot of interesting things going on, but I think there is some, kind of as Daniel mentioned, some bright spots and optimism in the market. Kind of switching over to capital markets, Daniel mentioned there was, I think, LB Pharma went out last month. MapLight actually, even though the government shut down, MapLight actually launched their IPO yesterday using kind of something from the 2018 shutdown playbook. I think Gossamer was the company that went out, during 2018 when the government was shut down. So hopefully, MapLight does well on their IPO post trading. I think last time I checked, LB Pharma was still above issue. So some signals that the markets are kind of thawing. I know we have, on the Cooley side, a number of, I've got an org meeting next week, and a number of companies talking about orging up at the end of the year, and talking to some bankers. I think they similarly have companies orging up later this year to try to tap into the Q1, Q2 potential window, particularly those companies that have milestones or catalysts during those periods, right? I think you want to kind of retain optionality. I think if the markets do open up, given who knows how long this shutdown is going to take, right? But the SEC is probably going to be backlogged in terms of reviewing S1s and whatnot. So I think companies want to kind of get in there, even if it's just submitting confidentially, and start kind of TTW meetings ahead of hopefully what is a long list of IPOs in 26. But we're hopeful.
We're hopeful as well. We're seeing green shoots and an opportunistic financing on news or solid advancements in technology. So Kevin's an example with Cardiome, recently closed Eupraxia, and like you, we're in a number of org meetings have commenced on potential deals, and there are companies preparing for a potential IPO window. It's not like you can start preparing the week before you want to launch, right? So that forward planning is important, and we've talked about that on a prior panel discussion here. So thanks a lot, Carlos, for those insights. Christopher, there's so much to talk about from a global pharma perspective, including advances in technology and how generative AI become disruptive, through to commercial type deals, which during challenging periods of finance can be a lifeline for earlier stage companies. What are you seeing at the moment, and any thoughts you have on the current environment?
Yeah, sure. Thanks again, Joe, for the invitation, and really great opportunity to connect and talk about the current ecosystem. Certainly, I think that these are interesting times. I think that's an understatement to make, and I think that really what resounds most with us in terms of what we see is adaptability and the ability to pivot and understand the headwinds and the tailwinds that come with this. one particular area that we've continued to monitor is certainly the advancement of programs across the therapeutic areas, across modalities, and really trying to identify those entities and companies that bring really unambiguous promotable advantages to the table in terms of whether or not there's an addressable patient population that can be targeted here through whatever approaches. One particular area that you've mentioned that we've focused on really is in and around the hype or the realness of machine learning and artificial intelligence, and what does that really bring. And I think what we're seeing from the environment is, there's truly tangible advances there. I think that what folks are doing are really taking a targeted approach to understand the use case scenario. Are there opportunities to leverage these types of approaches to advance, accelerate drug discovery within the walls of our R&D organization? Not a complete panacea yet, but I think that there are success case scenarios. Two that I can certainly point to from a Merck standpoint refer to our recent collaboration with Variational AI. I think that's a wonderful example of thinking about a test case scenario to explore the platforms that Variational brings, validate some initial concepts and thought process. And that really resulted in the culmination of a very nice collaboration that we look forward to. Another area that we've really spent a lot of time is building out relationships with the ecosystem in digital sciences at large. And people may be aware of our Merck Digital Sciences Studio, or MDS Studio, or MDSS. We have two studios, one in New Jersey, and the second one now recently in Montreal. But really, this effort is around enabling the next generation of innovative technologies through both partner relationships and mentorship programs. And I think that just underscores what we believe are, can we leverage this in a meaningful way, in a concerted way that makes sense for drug discovery at all multiple levels? So as far as where we think that the landscape is going, I think the proof will be in the pudding, and that's an area that we continue to exploit and leverage and really build off of the expertise that's in the outside world. And I think that the industry as a whole is looking at that as an important place to play, an important place to have infrastructure to help support their own internal drug discovery efforts.
Do you mind speaking a moment to international competition and potentially, not necessarily a changing landscape, but there is interesting technology and developments coming out of China, and that has implications globally for companies and their competitiveness and understanding sort of how different parts of the world can both pose challenges, but also be potential opportunities.
Sure. Yeah. I think it's a really interesting area that has grown and blossomed over the past couple of years. And I think if we look back in time in terms of the intentional effort that the Chinese government has made with respect to infrastructure, I think that what that particular geography has done has drawn a line in the sand and said, from a infrastructure as well as an establishment standpoint, we are looking to develop new molecules, both best in class and first in class. They have taken a concerted effort for incentivization, not only for talent, but for the industry as well. So you see a lot of companies that have set up shop in various regions within that sector, and leveraging their experiences with respect to onshoring of talent within the country in and of itself. And of course, this is a test case scenario, is the way that I think about that. But they have harmonized and tried to simplify their clinical trial regulatory elements as well as clinical trial execution. So you think about infrastructure in terms of what is being developed: talent, biotech hub, regulatory, as well as a large ecosystem across the landscape. And what does that result? It results in novel medicines that have been developed with use in an agnostic way in terms of modalities, but really trying to develop differentiated approaches. So for the recognition of molecules that have come out of that region that are in or near clinic, given the ability to conduct clinical trials rapidly and quickly, that allows one to then determine whether or not that molecule of interest has an opportunity to succeed in man. So you factor all of those elements in, it provides the lens that entities look at in terms of the output that one can tap into to address ultimately the patient, which is the ultimate customer. So that is a model which has helped shift a tremendous amount of innovation, the time and effort that has been built to develop that. Does it cause headwinds? Does it cause challenges? I think what it does is that it opens people's eyes in terms of that particular model and what needs to be done, both in other geographical regions to help elevate and accelerate in that area. I think ultimately it's best for the patient, because novel medicines will ultimately be provided to those individuals that need it the most. So there are certainly lessons to be learned there in terms of leveraging and taking those lessons learned to implementing. But it does, certainly from our side, it does raise the awareness of not only within the traditional regions that you'd find novel chemical entities, but now you've got a wider path, a wider breadth to source innovation to bring forward.
So I don't have the exact statistics here, but saw an interesting article a few weeks ago that perhaps a decade or 15 years ago, perhaps, low single-digit acquisition of assets from Chinese entities or companies, and it's now in the 40-something range, right, of acquisitions internationally, which really does show a material increase in R&D and development of novel products, as well as pharma's willingness to engage and acquire assets from that jurisdiction. So it's just food for thought in terms of a competitive landscape. Steve, thanks so much for joining us today. Really looking forward to your thoughts on sort of where we are in the competitive landscape and some of the geopolitical issues we're seeing and how it's affecting our industry, not just in the United States, but globally, and your thoughts could even encompass, for example, tariffs and the impact on large pharma. And I saw recently, I think it was Pfizer who agreed to lower its drug pricing among some of the other pharma companies. And then there's been messaging from others about development of manufacturing plants, et cetera, in the United States. So we have so much to talk about from the regulatory, but also the economic perspective, and would welcome your thoughts.
Well, really, it's been drinking out of a fire hose in Washington since January. So it's impossible to go over everything. But the way that I look at it is that it's a paradigm shift for the foundations of the biopharma ecosystem in the United States that's happened since January. You can look at it and say that for the last 30 years, biopharma in the United States has rested on, I think, on four legs. One has been generous funding for basic research. The United States has funded research more generously than anywhere else in the rest of the world. There's been science-based regulatory and predictable regulatory environment. There's been strong IP protection, and there's been an immigration policy that's allowed the free flow of ideas and of people around the world. All of those are more uncertain now than they were 9 months ago. Some of them have changed, I think, irrevocably. You mentioned the Pfizer deal. So Pfizer's came to a deal, which, by the way, the exact terms of the deal have not been disclosed, and it's not clear if they ever will be, with the White House on what they call most favored nation drug pricing. That has four elements. One is Pfizer agreeing to sell all of its products to the Medicaid plan, which is a plan that's aimed at providing drugs to people with the lowest incomes in the United States. It's going to provide all of its portfolio of drugs to Medicaid at MFN pricing, most favored nation pricing. In theory, that means it'll be the lowest price that any developed country gets for Pfizer's products. But again, the formula for exactly how they're calculating that hasn't been disclosed yet. They've agreed to massive investments in U.S. manufacturing, and over time that they will manufacture the same value of products in the United States that will be equivalent to whatever it is that they manufacture overseas. So it'll be net, zero on manufacturing U.S. versus overseas. They've gotten a reprieve for 3 years on tariffs, and they've agreed that they're going to offer some of their products on web platforms for direct to patient or possibly direct to business purchases. Basically, that's going to be at net prices, net of discounts and rebates that they give to PBMs. The deal for Pfizer as a company it will have negligible effects on Pfizer. Pfizer got it's very favorable for them, and I think their investors have demonstrated appreciation for that. And that's largely because Pfizer doesn't have very much Medicaid exposure. It's only 3% of their global revenues, 5% of the US revenues. The question is, what happens if this deal becomes a template more broadly across the industry? There are 17 companies that the Trump administration has requested MFN negotiations from. We know that Lilly has made a deal with the White House also. We'll find out very soon what the terms of that deal are. I expect it's going to be similar to Pfizer's. We are probably going to see a similar deal from Regeneron soon. And there's intensified pressure on other companies to come to similar deals. One analysis that I've seen from a consulting company called Vital Transformation is that if the Medicaid pricing deal that Pfizer had is applied across the industry, and if the MFN formula is actually the lowest OECD price adjusted for GDP, the cost for the entire biopharma industry over a decade would be $100 billion from Medicaid. The interesting thing is that Medicaid price is also a ceiling for the 340B discount price, and that cost under the current formulas would add another $250 billion in lost revenues to the biopharma industry over a decade. It won't be evenly distributed, as you can see from the case of Pfizer, which has little exposure to Medicaid. This isn't the end of the story. The Trump administration has signaled that it's working on so-called mandatory demonstration projects under CMS for Medicare Part D and Medicare Part D. It's sent the rules to the White House for review, and it's possible that they could be released. We don't know what's going to be in them, but you could, and we don't know for sure that they're going to do it. But if they do, it's likely to be something like what they tried in the first Trump administration, which would cap prices in Medicare Part B and Part D. I guess that's kind of it on the pricing pressures. Oh, and also we're going to see in about a week, we're going to see the results of the Trump administration's first round of Medicare drug price negotiations. I think we can expect those prices to come in quite low. They're going to want to demonstrate that they got better prices than what the Biden administration got during their so-called negotiations. And so I think we'll see that going forward. And then you can shift over really quickly to the other elements, the other kind of four elements of the of the public policy that underpins biotech ecosystem. FDA's lost roughly 20% of its staff since January, and there's been a certain amount of volatility. We've seen, the Center for Biologics Director, Vinay Prasad, hired, resigned, and come back again. There's a new Center Director for the Center of Drugs, George Tidmarsh. And of course, they're in a shutdown now, so they're not accepting new applications. On the other elements, on immigration and on the flow of people and ideas to the United States, maybe long term, that might be one of the more significant changes that we're seeing. I think it's becoming increasingly difficult for talent and increasingly unattractive, honestly, for talent from around the world to come to the United States to study or to work. And the NIH funding environment is also, there's a great deal of uncertainty about what's happened there and what's going to happen there going forward. Maybe that's a good place to stop. So a lot of these things are up in the air. Some of them, I think, as I said, they're kind of irrevocable changes, and some of them could be dialed back, could be modified. I would say on the MFN thing, the other thing that I think that's really significant is that this is the first time that the pharmaceutical industry has been willing to negotiate with the White House about pricing policy for specific companies, and we're going to see it, probably for all these 17 companies. And what I would say is that I don't think that this is the last time. It's not the last time in the Trump administration, and it's certainly not going to be the last time going forward. Future administrations now, we've got a precedent set that individual drug companies are negotiating pricing policy with the White House. That's going to be part of the reality in the United States going forward.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, over time, there has been a pendulum with respect to the FDA and its approach. I think it's fair to say, and you've summarized it well, that there are just many more aspects of the industry that are uncertain from the regulatory government perspective at the moment, and hopefully over time those work themselves out in a way that isn't long-term detrimental to the industry and in the United States, although it may open up opportunities in other geographic areas depending on what occurs. So with that, we want to maybe pivot back for a moment to, given where we are in this landscape, what are some things that companies should be really thinking about? And I know that there is an issuer that I've worked with that has had an uninterrupted train of success, right? There have been ups and downs and challenges, and it's about how the management team is both resilient and adapts to current market forces and circumstances. So with that, Kevin, Cardium's been around for 18 or so years, and I'm sure there were times where the management team had to really consolidate and think through issues in order to succeed. There's probably at times an element of luck as well. And it really is the management teams and how they can adapt in challenging times, which ultimately lead to long-term success. Any thoughts along that on sort of, given this environment and sort of some optimism for existing companies and what to think about going forward?
Very broadly, I think at Cardium, I think one of the things our management team, I would say one of the characteristics of the management team is persistence, or resilience, or the ability to, work through difficult times, because obviously it hasn't been 18 years of continued growth and success. We've had some really tough challenges along the way, and just listening to the other panelists talk about changes at the FDA or changes in the government, I'll just take that as an example. Just the regulatory pathway that's changed for us over 18 years. When we first started, for medical devices, everybody went to Europe first. It was, if you got your device approved in Europe, you go there with very little clinical data. Took 3 months to get a CE mark, and then you could just start doing cases in Europe and start treating patients there. I learned a lot from those cases before you started your pivotal study in the US, and that would take 3 years. And then you would go through FDA approval, which would take 18 months. And so the regulatory pathway was really challenging in the early 2000s, 2010s. And then the pendulum swung the other way. In Europe, they had some challenges with, there was a big court case around breast implants that were using the wrong technology, and they introduced a whole new suite of regulations called the MDR, Medical Device Regulations. And that took approval cycles from months to years in Europe. Really made the regulatory pathway in Europe much more challenging, whereas the FDA became much more engaged, much more responsive. They were much more collaborative with companies. And so, when we pivoted, we had to pivot. We'd done a lot of our early work in Europe. We built up all these relationships with doctors, hospitals in Europe. And then the regulatory approval cycle in Europe went from 3 months to 2 years. With a similar amount of data, whereas our FDA approval cycle, we applied in December and we got approval in August, so it took 8 months, which was a much more rapid response. Now that's changing again. Our lead reviewer was fired by the DOJ department earlier this year, and then they hired her back a few months later, and so there's impacts to that regulatory pathway. And so you kind of these environments just change all the time. It's very difficult to predict where we'll be 12 months from now. Tariffs is another challenge for us. Having manufacturing in Canada and Costa Rica and wanting to import into the US, we have to think about the impact of tariffs on medical devices coming from those markets and looking at our manufacturing. And you try and plan for all of these things. But actually, one of my favorite quotes is from Mike Tyson, the boxer. Don't know if you know it, but one of his famous quotes is, "Everyone has a plan until you get punched in the face." And you've got to figure out what you're going to do. So, I think the characteristics of our team, we had a lot of innocence when we started this company. We didn't know what we were going to come up against. But we had a very resilient, persistent team who never wanted to give up. We're mostly engineers starting this company, and we really wanted to make something that worked. And that kind of set the challenge. And then you go through all of those challenges where the device doesn't work, or something happens in your first human testing, or you come up against technology challenges or regulatory challenges or funding challenges, where it was a huge issue for us. Every time we've tried to raise financing was making sure we brought on the right investors. We went through some very challenging times with the economic downturn and COVID, and we were talking about IPOs earlier. And medical technology IPOs have recently just had their first IPOs in over 3 years. There was not a single IPO for medical devices, medical technology in Canada or the US. And so, I think making sure you have a team that you work well with together and can support each other, because you do go through some very challenging times, and making sure you adapt to those, because you can't plan for everything.
Thank you very much. Dan, any words of wisdom or advice in terms of the current environment and for companies planning? And maybe touch a little bit on the concept of dual tracking. I know the risks associated with IPO. Is that something every company should be thinking about? Is it, really limited to certain types of companies or stages of development? Or I'm just curious on thoughts on that topic.
So I think I would never pretend to be an operator, so I won't give operational advice. I would just say, I think capital becomes the absolute most important asset that a company has in times of heightened uncertainty. you can't control who's willing to give you money, but you can control how much you spend to some extent. And so what we have advised companies now for quite some time, we had a downturn in the capital markets here a couple of years ago when we advised companies it was time to think about rationalizing portfolios and trying to focus really on what are the assets that investors want to see you develop? What are they valuing today? It's not like from an operational standpoint, it's probably not how you should run the business. You should have a portfolio theory. But in these days, you probably have to have very good conversations with your shareholders, very open, transparent conversations to understand what do they want you to fund in your pipeline. And then you have to make hard decisions to say, we're going to rationalize the pipeline to focus on where investors want us focused. So that's like a little bit of motherhood and apple pie, but that's critical in today's market. With respect to contingency planning, I think you're right, which is nobody can go into the IPO process right now and say it's definitively going to be, there's definitively a valuation out there that's attractive for us and capital that's going to be sufficient for us. You can control some of that stuff with your syndicate. Your own internal syndicate can control that. But beyond that, you're gonna have to figure it out through testing the waters, whether there's an appetite. We have seen an increased use of dual tracking as a way to ensure that there is, or at least maximize the likelihood that there is a opportunity, an exit opportunity for the private investors. I think if you go and look at the background of the Metsera deal, it's like a classic, the way this is supposed to work. They were a couple of days away from their IPO pricing. They received a proposal. They brought Pfizer under NDA, put them into a data room, and they ended up deciding that they felt like where the IPO was heading and how the book was coming together was better and more attractive for their investors than the proposal that was on the table, which was a non-Pfizer proposal. They ended up going public, and then within whatever it is, 6-7 months, they turned around and sold the company to Pfizer at a nice attractive valuation. So the folks who participated in that IPO ended up having a nice return on the other side. But they put themselves in a position where at least they had the options to weigh whether to get sold at that point in time or to go public. And as I mentioned before, we're seeing more and more companies decide they'd prefer to go down the sale route as private companies than to go have to fund 100% from the insiders, put up 100% of the book as insiders and go try to fund and fight through the IPO process.
Thanks very much. Carlos, we've talked a little bit about some of the challenges in the private markets and the public markets not being equal opportunity for all companies. Are you guys seeing other types of funding avenues, perhaps commercial deals that maybe wouldn't have happened, a couple of years ago, but are now being taken as opportunities for funding as well? Like, for example, and this isn't directly applicable, but variational AI, and we can talk about that in a moment, Christopher, but that's a Vancouver-based company that, phenomenal. So $349 million transaction that, will provide opportunity and funding and the ability to continue to develop its technologies through a commercial type arrangement. So I'm not sure if you're seeing a bit more of that as an uptick, Carlos, or any thoughts you have on companies preparing.
Yeah, no, certainly. I think, no stone left unturned in terms of bringing money in. Obviously in this environment, I think, as I think a number of the panelists alluded to, I think, investors, given how tight money is, right, investors are really requiring companies to kind of narrow their scope, narrow their pipeline. I think, the kind of the platform play is, I'm not saying it's dead, but, in this environment, it's really tough to kind of pull off. I think a lot of, companies that have multiple assets, we've been seeing them talk to pharmas for kind of strategic, non-dilutive kind of funding collaborations, more so I think than we would have in the past, right? Companies that would have just kind of kept that kind of in the in-house in the pipeline, and maybe go public and then have some more shots at goal. So we're certainly seeing a lot of that, and I'd welcome Christopher's thoughts on that too when we get to him. And then another avenue I think we see, which nothing new, but I think I've been seeing a lot of companies explore venture debt when they get funded. Obviously, venture debt something you can't just go out to a bank when you're 3 months from running out of cash and get the loan. It's something that you typically have to go do shortly concurrently with or shortly after an equity raise, just to kind of reduce the risk on the lender side. And then companies can either use that or not, but it's kind of there to kind of bridge you to either a next round during a difficult spot, or just kind of extend the cash runway if you don't want to raise equity. But certainly a lot of different mechanisms being explored in this tight environment. And then just to kind of piggyback off of what Daniel said in the dual tracking, again, I think that's another thing we are consistently seeing. It's not like you said, Joe, it's not for prepping for an IPO is not always going to be an option for everybody. It's not it's expensive, but for those companies that can, I think we are seeing them kind of still explore that option. In addition to Metsera, which Daniel mentioned, Carmot, RaiseBio kind of had a similar scenario when they got taken out. RaiseBio was already public, Carmot was not. So definitely good strategies if you want to kind of call it control your destiny, right? Where not solely relying on the exit, but also just going straight to the IPO in case that falls through. And then other companies, kind of try tracking, right? Like also contemplating a potential crossover or just an equity raise at that same time. So a lot of kind of options on the table right now. But yeah, definitely, what I'm seeing in the boardroom, companies, I think we use the term grit and scrappy and variations of that. I think everybody's trying to be as lean as they can, being thoughtful before doing big hires, trying to maybe outsource some work. I was on a call a couple of weeks ago with some industry folks that were talking about how they're really kind of providing more oversight over the CRO process, because I think the prices have just skyrocketed in the recent years for a number of reasons with CROs. So even maybe somebody kind of threw out potentially tying certain projects that CROs are doing to kind of milestones and kind of keeping them kind of in check and routinely making sure they're performing and delivering. So I think definitely keeping good oversight over the P&L, and I think investors are kind of looking at and revising budgets kind of like a hawk. So all those things that I think a few years ago we didn't worry about too much, but definitely prevalent today.
Thanks a lot. So Christopher, given the breadth of Merck globally, what do you think companies should be thinking about in terms of interacting with multinational pharma and ability to, get the attention of relevant companies, and are there particular approaches in this environment you'd recommend, and potentially even discussing, thoughts around from a capital perspective. There are certain regions which may be attractive for doing clinical trials, like in Australia. Like a lot of our issuer clients have considered that, and many have incorporated subs there for that purpose. So any thoughts you have on sort of how to stretch a dollar now, and also how to interact with large companies that have the ability to provide both non-dilutive or strategic, let's say, relationships and capital in this environment?
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, I'll echo what has been said before. Now is the time to hone your craft, really, I think is the key take-home message, and thinking about various scenario planning. I love the concept of rationalizing pipeline and having to make tough decisions in today's day and age. And prioritization is really the key. And how can you operationally be efficient and lean with your organization in terms of getting to key inflection points and key milestones. I mean, that's the type of information from a partnering standpoint that we would be looking at as we think about the discussions with various entities at whatever the stage are. What is your plan? What is it going to take for you to get there? What are the key data decision points to move a program forward? What are the various scenarios that could take place? That type of time and effort that's devoted to that goes a long way when interacting with Merck or anyone else, because it really shows the intent in trying to develop a successful plan and implementing on that. As far as interacting with large multinationals, I think from a partnering standpoint, what we really value is the regular cadence with counterparts, so that we're aware of the opportunities of the programs, because knowing how programs, and again, across modalities, across therapeutics, we're agnostic. We're really trying to find opportunity that will accelerate, complement, or even disrupt the R&D engine that Merck is. We really think about knowing and understanding the nuances of every opportunity. So as our strategy evolves internally, if we're aware and familiar that we can turn back and say, company X has been developing a particular approach that may be able to address this particular scenario solution to drive a solution, that would be an opportunity that could be created out of just knowing what the entity has. So I think that there is some opportunism there, but it really relies upon having a good collaborative, transparent understanding of where things are with companies. So I would certainly advocate for smaller companies to be in regular contact with their BD counterparts so that they're up to date, both in terms of development of a platform and the products therein, but also, hey, well, there are inflection points that are coming, or we are having discussions, because there is always the element of FOMO from everybody that wants to make sure that they are seeking the greatest opportunities. Maybe I'll just delve a bit in terms of platform versus product, and I fully agree that today's day and age is not heavily around platforms, it's around products. I think that everyone can agree that a platform is really essential to driving new programs, but at the end of the day, you need products coming out of that, because that's ultimately what's going to get into patients. So I think that's more prevalent today than it was probably in the heyday of 2021, 2022 timeframe. And I think that as we think about what relationships look like from a funding standpoint, it really kind of depends on the opportunity, right? I think that every company is looking at each individual company asset opportunity in isolation, in the sense of what can this particular opportunity bring for patients, number one, but then what makes sense for both companies? What is it that the partner is seeking, and what is it that Merck or any other large company is willing to invest in that, so that it's a win-win for both sides and you can accelerate that medicine as quickly as possible. So I guess that's another way of saying that being open and willing to contemplate various structures is always the best way. And that's the way that we walk into things. We know what works in terms of our investment committee and in terms of research collaborations and options and things along those lines. But having that open conversation and dialogue around what makes sense for both sides is always the best way. And as long as there are two committed teams at the table that really are excited about accelerating that medicine, the deal structure will follow in a way that makes sense to get it into patients as quickly as possible.
That's fantastic, thanks. And it does sound, given some of the topics we've touched on, that not losing focus on geographic and tech-related issues, right? That there could be opportunities, let's say, not just in North America, elsewhere, and potentially material ones. And then
most certainly. And to your point, I think that every company should be looking for innovation irrespective of the borders. And I think that the China example that we were speaking about earlier is just one area. We see innovation right across the board in terms of various areas within the globe. You know, you spoke about the clinical trial development within Australia. I think that really kind of set the bar in terms of developing that regulatory flexibility early on. And that was a model that was probably adopted by many others as one component. Australia is doing a really tremendous job, especially within the RNA space. I think that they are really leading a charge in that area. And what we see are, you know, where are people making bets to really drive that innovation? Think about Switzerland. There's another geography where there's a tremendous amount of concentration of a very a dedicated life sciences ecosystem across from very early VC, early startup, biotech, all the way through to very large pharma. So that tight-knit ecosystem is one where it's ripe to fuel the innovation that folks are interested in digging into.
It's perfect. Yeah, look, I think it's an understatement to say biology is complex, right? But there is the potential over time, if not immediate, for generative AI to play a material role and ultimately benefit patients. But as part of that technology rolling out and refining over time, where there could be staggering improvements that just happen next month, we just don't know, right? So that technology has the ability to disrupt, and therefore, you know, being aware of what's happening in the environment could, like, companies may be, right, depending on what occurs and how rapid the advancements are. So Steve, given the let's call it the very interesting geopolitical regulatory backdrop, I don't know, any words of wisdom for companies thinking how to navigate this time?
You know, I think if you're talking about FDA, for example, there's a great deal of uncertainty. Some of that uncertainty, what did Rumsfeld say, the known unknowns or something like that. You know, some of that uncertainty is in clear areas, right? You know, it's clear that there's a great deal of uncertainty and difficulty associated with vaccines. That's spilled over, unfortunately, into mRNA technology more broadly. On the other hand, there's a receptivity at FDA for psychedelics. There are sensitivities and concerns about therapies for children, especially neuropsychiatric drugs for children. I think that's something that's been a particular concern of the HHS secretary and of the FDA commissioner. When you're looking at the bigger picture of what's going to happen with MFN pricing, with the pressure to onshore manufacturing in the United States, well, that's going to create difficulties, but it's also going to create opportunities. Obviously, there's massive investment in manufacturing in the United States. That's going to create certain kinds of demand, obviously, and there must be opportunities there. I think it also is going to create opportunities for advanced manufacturing, for continuous manufacturing, and other technologies that are going to be really in high demand. Because one of the reasons why there's been so much manufacturing outside of the United States is because it's been less expensive and perhaps higher quality. So there's going to be a great deal of demand in the United States for lower cost and higher quality manufacturing and incorporating new technologies. I think another space to watch is geopolitical tension between the United States and China. What's going to happen as legislation moves forward that's intended to disengage the United States and China. Last year, the Biosecure Act didn't pass, but there's a version of it that is possible, I would say even probable, that it's going to be incorporated this year in the Defense Appropriations Bill. It's got different wrinkles from last year's bill, but I think and maybe one of the bigger kind of like big picture things, and it is maybe it's consistent with some of the things that others have said today, is that there's differential effects, I think, on companies according to their scale. I think that a lot of the things that are happening at FDA, that are happening in terms of the administration's negotiations on pricing, are going to have less effect on big pharmas, and they're going to have a stronger effect on the smallest companies. And that's also true for the pressures that are happening on NIH and on biomedical research funding.
Thanks. Curious for your views, given your breadth of knowledge of the industry, like you cover all aspects. Where do you see current AI development impacting drug development, and if you were to telegraph out 6 months or a year, I know none of us can predict the future, but is this going to be transformative, or is it 10, 20 years away from really playing a material role in advancements, just given what you're seeing from different companies?
Well, it already is being transformative. I don't think that there's a company that's doing drug development that doesn't feel that their work is being transformed by AI. But I think in terms of I think in maybe two different domains. One is what's its effect going to be on the regulatory environment. Regulators around the world are trying to incorporate AI, and I think that could lead to regulatory efficiencies. And in terms of what its effects on drug development are going to be, it looks to me like a lot of what happens in AI is kind of what appears to be an overnight success story. It's something where that takes a long time. You don't hear anything for a long time, and then all of a sudden you hear something that's binary, and it seems like it happened really suddenly, right? But in fact, of course, it's a result of work that's been happening for a great deal of time. There's a lot of enthusiasm. There's a lot of money that's going into AI and drug development. The big question, from my point of view, one of the big questions is going to be how is that going to be regulated? And I think that's an interesting thing. I was speaking with the new head of MHRA, the UK drug regulator, recently, and he picked that out as an area of strength for the UK, and believes that that's a place where there can be competitive advantage among different regulatory agencies. That'll be an interesting space to watch.
So I think, given all the remarks today, I think it's fair to say that we collectively are optimistic. Although there are challenges, lots of people see opportunities on the other side of it, and it really is about getting from here to wherever it is that each company's destination, where they want to arrive. So this has been a really engaging conversation today. Maybe as we move towards wrapping up, each person, if you have a thought or two that you want to leave with the audience, would appreciate it. Maybe we'll do the rounds one more time and then start to think about wrapping up. The one thing to consider for anyone that's watching or will watch the recording in the future, we've always, as a community, been very open. And if anyone has questions or wants to reach out or contact people on this panel about business opportunities in banking or legal or wherever, please feel free to do so. So with that, Kevin, any closing thoughts or remarks of?
Sure. Yeah, just really briefly, I'll go back to kind of what we talked about with our management team, and just we're saying some of the characteristics. We were just talking about this recently, so it's kind of fresh in my mind. But when you said we're feeling optimistic, I think that we kind of said there were three things at Cardium. We started the company and nobody had any medical device background. We were all engineers and we wanted to build something great. And so I think the word we use there is innocent. Like, we were innocent of the challenges that lay ahead, and we didn't know what we were going to face. The second characteristic is optimism. You have to be optimistic to take on a big challenge and say you have to believe it's going to work out. If you don't believe in that it's going to work out okay in the future, you're not optimistic of your chance of success. makes any project even more challenging. So you have to be optimistic and believe that it's going to work out. And then thirdly, you have to be persistent, or we used to say stubborn, which is because it will fail. Will have challenges. We had a lot of technology challenges. We had a lot of regulatory challenges. I mean, we've been talking about the economic challenges, financing challenges, geopolitical challenges. There are challenges, and we'll come up against roadblocks. There will be very hard times, and that's not going to change. AI is a huge disruptor. That's going to be a challenge and an opportunity. But when you come up against this challenge, you have to believe, you have to be optimistic and believe it'll work out. And if you don't know how it's going to work out, then you have to be stubborn or persistent and say, well, we'll figure it out. And I think that's been the theme at Cardium, and I think it's characteristics of a lot of successful companies is you have to be optimistic and believe that something will work, and if it's not working, you have to figure out how it's going to work.
Great thoughts, thank you. Dan, any departing?
I would actually just echo exactly what was just said, which is I think the characteristic of successful companies in biopharma and medical devices is a kind of probably undeserved or unnatural level of optimism and persistence. And, I think people just have to continue. There's a reason why folks come into this industry in the first place. They're not, naive to the risks that exist in our industry. It can be as simple as, you had a whole bunch of gene therapy companies that were told that the holy grail was high dose systemic administration of AAV. And it turns out, well, that actually is a horrible thing. And, you're seeing patients die. And so suddenly now the folks who were doing local administration, who were told they were crazy, now they're going to be the winners, right? And you saw Vertex as a perfect example, where Vertex watched Gilead basically introduce a functional cure for Hep C and destroyed Vertex's business. And instead of just kind of giving up, Vertex said, we're going to take all the lessons we learned on what we did wrong in Hep C, and we're going to apply it to our CF franchise. And we're going to bolster that CF franchise in ways that we're going after functional cures with combinations to make sure that we're going to be cutting edge. And they built the company back up, right? And so it really is the people who are the most optimistic, who say, I'm not going to give up. I'm going to learn lessons from failures that we have. Those are the ones that are going to continue to be successful. And I know that's the vast majority of people who come into this industry.
Absolutely. And look, a driving feature of every executive I've ever met is ultimately wanting to do the best thing they can for patients, right? This is ultimately about patients and providing remedies for unmet medical needs. Carlos, any final thoughts here on what companies could think about in this environment and how to?
Yeah, sure. And well said by Kevin and Daniel, but and again, a lot of the same things, I think, from kind of, and I think somebody on the panel said, caution them, they're not an operator. I'm not an operator. I'm, counsel here, but I do sit in a lot of kind of management meetings and board meetings. And I think one thing, there have been, companies, unfortunately in the last kind of 12, 24 months that I've seen just kind of fail, right? Private companies that close up shop, have to dissolve, return money to investors, et cetera. I think one thing that was said earlier too is just communication. I think setting expectations with investors and board members, on what milestones or what goals kind of each stakeholder, wants to reach, I think is great. I think in some of the cases I've seen that, where things didn't work out, I think there was a lot of time, a lack of communication and maybe, missed communication in terms of expectations and where, direction that investors or certain directors wanted the company to go. So, I'd recommend doing that and just, planning ahead. Things kind of in this environment take longer than you'd expect, fundraising, deals, et cetera. So, never too early to kind of start thinking about kind of the next milestone or the next fundraising round, et cetera. And overall, again, I'm optimistic. I think we're seeing signs of the markets turning. So hopefully, the rest of the year and 2026 will be be a little better than this year.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Carlos. I would go as far as to say that investors are very focused on the team, not just the technology, because it's rare that companies don't have to pivot, or when they encounter issues, figure out, the appropriate response, and that's where ultimately success can come, right? How to deal with those challenges effectively. Christopher, any closing thoughts here on moving forward?
Yeah, sure. So I'll echo many of the same competencies that my co-panelists have talked about, but it will include the adaptability component. I think that here, in times like these, that being able to be receptive to the inputs and internalize and think about how can we utilize this as an opportunity, whether it's through adaptability or shifting or pivoting or re-engineering. Those are all considerations that one needs to take. But staying true to the core mission of who the entity is and what are the medicines that are trying to create, I think is really kind of important. But adaptability provides that means to think about what are my options and what can I and what can I not do in a meaningful way to advance these therapies, but also be respectful of the stakeholders that I have at the table. I think, and this is a comment that I use a lot when I think about the partnering process, it takes a village. I think it really is important to underscore that we're all in this together, that every player of this ecosystem has something meaningful to offer, and that we as a community have to work together to bring these medicines forward, and that there are headwinds. There's no doubt about that, but by working together, we can achieve a good common goal, which is to get the medicines into patients. There are only opportunities as far as one can take them, right? And if you don't take that extra step to really kind of have your strategic plan in place, it won't go very far. So I would certainly endorse the concept of try true and hard, continue to advocate for your positions, and there will always be conversations that are meaningful. And of course, every relationship begins with a conversation, so maintain those moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Tenacity is key. Steve, closing remarks?
What I would say is I think it's really important for people to be engaged with policymakers, engaged with lawmakers, because there isn't a great deal of expertise among lawmakers, among policymakers in the life sciences. They don't always, and very often, they don't understand what the unintended consequences of actions could be. And so I think that it's really critical for everyone in the industry who can to be engaged with policymakers and lawmakers to explain how their business works, how the science works, and what's needed from a public policy perspective to keep things going in the direction that everybody wants them to go.
That's great. Thanks. On behalf of Blake's and myself and our broader life sciences community, thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time today. The most valuable thing you can give is your time, and we really appreciate it. Thank you for your thoughtful remarks.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us, those in the room and online. I've actually been receiving emails from people that are online who are telling me how amazing they thought this discussion was. So thank you, Joe, for moderating and hosting us, and Kevin, Daniel, Carlos, Christopher, and Steve. It was a really, really great discussion, and I think your closing remarks really summed it up. With respect to, resilience, in a sense, you always bring that up, Kevin, that you had no idea what you were getting into, which in some ways is great until all of a sudden you get punched in the face, and then you have to really double down. But also I think, and I know we in BC really believe this, that we are a very strong ecosystem, and community and engagement within the ecosystem is so important, because we're all here to help each other be successful. And I think that was really summed up nicely as well. And a big thanks to the Blake's team. I now know where Laura is. She's watching this in another room to make sure the tech's working. So big thanks to her as well. We do have a couple of upcoming events that we always like to let people know about. So we go around the province once a year to other areas. So we are going to be in Kelowna next week, I guess. And then our big annual Invest in BC conference is coming up at the end of the month. I believe we have over 70 investors confirmed to be attending. The format is approximately 30 companies will pitch over 2 mornings, and the afternoons are all partnering. So if you haven't already enrolled or registered, please do so. Last year, I think we had 450 partnering meetings over 2 afternoons in BC, which is pretty extraordinary. And we've added more spots this year because there was actually a backlog last year. So with that, I would again like to thank Blake's, and we always like to thank our annual supporters, which I think are about 2 up here on the screen, and hope you have a great day.